welcome everybody to Hope for Our Times, and what a program today. LA is on fire, and that's not from the same fires that were going on back in January when there was no water in the fire hydrants. This time it's the riots from people who are waving flags that are not American flags. I'll be talking about that in my news break coming up later on today. We have the dynamic with the flotilla girl, whatever her name is, Greta Thunberg. That stuff's going on. We got wars and rumors of wars going on everywhere. I'll deal with those things later on. But right now, I have my special guest. Just great to have him back with me. It's been a while. Bill Salus is joining me today. And wow, Bill, unbelievable. Thank you for joining me. And as I look at everything going on right now, I look at what's going to happen with Iran, the U.S., you got Israel. The dynamics just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The Ayatollah says we're going to do whatever we darn well please. There's rumors of drone attacks against U.S. troops. All kinds of things are out there. I almost am thinking, I don't even know where to begin, but I think we just begin with the Mideast. But anyways, welcome, and what do you have to say before we get rolling?
Oh, you're absolutely correct, Tom, and it's great to be on your program again. The Middle East is going ballistic. What's going to happen with Iran? Let's talk about Iran and Ezekiel 38 for a good portion of today. But I sincerely think the negotiations are going to fail, and Israel is going to have to level the boom on Iran's nuclear program. And if they fail, that might even include a coalition with the United States and Israel. And that might also involve biblical prophecies, too, with Iran, maybe even in Jeremiah chapter 49, the Elam prophecy. We've talked about that before in your program. And so let's talk about Iran a little bit if you want today, Tom.
I do. I think we really need to, especially things are definitely escalating for anybody that's paid attention to the news over the weekend. And here we are, it's the first day of the week, and looking, going, man. And, it appeared that with the U.S., when I look at it with the U.S., it appeared that with the Trump administration, they're going to say, Israel, you're on your own with Iran. But now as I'm watching things go, I'm guessing there could very well be a coalition with the U.S., with Iran. But I'll let you answer that as we go, because we have a lot of things to get through. And I want to go to this place first, Bill, because a lot of people will say, when you come to Ezekiel chapter 38, how do you know that it's during the last days? It's a prophecy for the last days. It's something prophetic for the future. Bill, I read Ezekiel 38. What do you say to those who are skeptics who are saying that? So how do we know these are the latter years or the latter days, and the prophecy is fulfilled in the latter years or latter days?
Well, the prophecy is really quite clear, especially in two places, Ezekiel 38, verses 8 and 16. And it tells us in Ezekiel 38:8 that after many days, speaking to Russia and its coalition, Gog and Magog, after many days you'll be visited in the latter years. So it clearly spells that out. You'll come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They're brought out of the nations. Now all of them dwell safely. And it refers to that again in Ezekiel 38, verse 16, as the latter days, or similar terminology. So it tells us a couple things here. One is that the latter days happened when Israel became a nation. That's when the end times clock started ticking for the end times. And also that's significant because the Jews have come back into the land officially on May 14th of 1948. So it tells us it's in the latter years, the latter days, and we're living in those days. Not only is Israel rebirth, but the super sign I've heard you talk about is that all the end time signs are converging. There's no weapon that hasn't been fashioned, no national relationship that has not been formed yet, or no technology not developed that would slow down the coming of the final prophecies of the end times. And when they come, they'll happen sequentially and in rapid succession. So I think we're clearly in the latter days, and that's when Ezekiel 38 says it will happen.
So let me ask you this, since you alluded to it there. When I look at Bible prophecy, I do not believe once the events start taking place, there's a pause button that God's going to hit. We don't read. I don't have that understanding when I'm looking at Bible prophecy. What I have the understanding of is once the events begin, especially Israel being gathered back in the land again, but once the events of the last days begin, they're just going to happen faster and faster and faster, and there's no pause. Is that the way you read that?
I think so. Sequentially, rapid succession. One event's going to lead to the other, and each one gets sort of seems more powerful behind the other one on the heels. I concur. They're going to happen in rapid succession, in my estimation. It's been, over 7 decades since Israel became a nation, but we're not going to wait for another 7 decades for the next one, and another 7 decades to follow that. It's going to happen in succession, in my estimation.
And it also explains why things, every day we wake up, there's something else that happened, and we go, oh man, it's just unbelievable. Let me read these verses to bring everybody on board that's watching, maybe some that aren't familiar with the Ezekiel 38 prophecies. And then I want to get on to some of the preconditions, and then what does it really mean with Israel dwelling securely. I want to go back and forth with you on that. But beginning in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, the Bible says, after many days you'll be visited. In the latter years you'll come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. You will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops and many peoples with you. Thus says the Lord God, on that day it shall come to pass that thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. You will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, to take plunder and to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited. That reminds me of Mark Twain, how he described Israel, the land of Israel, when he first came there. It's just a wasteland, and here it is. This is what God even says: the waste places that are again inhabited, and against the people gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land, Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take great plunder? I'll stop reading there for now. Bill, looking at this, when will Israel dwell securely? And by the way, before we even go there, we have a lot of different books and even DVDs in the Hope for Our Times store. I encourage you to go and check out the different things, including what we're going to be talking about today. Bill, we also did a documentary regarding some of these things that we're talking about, not all of them. So these things are available in the Hope for Our Times store. Check it out. And also check out our events page. We have a conference coming up in Mexico in just a couple of weeks. And along with, we'll be in Texas. We know the Israel Summit was canceled because of Islamic threats in Texas. Bill, you saw that. That's a big deal. That was canceled in Texas. We have a conference planned for September in Texas, the great state of Texas. Man, this Islamic stuff is just off the charts, which I'm sure you would like to speak to that too. But let's just go here first. I'm sorry, let me get to this question first. What are the preconditions in Ezekiel 38 in the verses?
Yeah, when you read Ezekiel 38, 8 through 13, you uncovered a few of the preconditions. Israel has to be brought out from the nations in the latter years, brought back from the sword of persecution into a land that had long been desolate. And we would put check marks there, Tom. Those things have been happening since 1948. But then it goes on and says they have to be a peaceful people living in a land of unwalled villages, dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates, and then having silver and gold and acquired livestock and goods, possessing booty and great plunder, which are the very items that Gog and Magog is coming after, the plunder and the booty. That's one of their motives. So is Israel dwelling, and all those other preconditions, are they dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates? And in my estimation, they're not, Tom. They got walls all around them to the north to fight off Hezbollah. around the Gaza, even around Jordan. They got a partition wall about 403 miles inside of Israel proper to keep Palestinian terrorism out of it. At some points, that's 20 feet high, filled with concrete. So they're not dwelling securely presently, but we find out when they will dwell securely 10 chapters earlier in Ezekiel chapter 28, which says the following. The reason they're not dwelling securely is because there's a painful thorn and a pricking briar around them, according to Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 24. Do you want to read that, Tom?
Verse 20, which verse was it? 24?
Let's go to Ezekiel 28, verses 24.
Yeah.
Talk about that, and then we'll go read verses 25 and 26.
You bet. So verse 24 says, and there shall no longer be a prickling briar or a painful thorn for the house of Israel from among those who are around them, who despise them. Then they shall know that I am the Lord God.
Okay, so stop there for a minute.
Yeah.
The reason they're not dwelling securely at present is because there's a prickling briar and a painful thorn around them, the Arabs around them, the Arab states, who fought against them in 1948, 1967, 1973. They've been dealing with Hezbollah, they've been dealing with Hamas. They're pricking briar and a painful thorn, according to Ezekiel. They despise them, and they have to be dealt with. And so we read verses 25 and 26, and it tells us when they will be dealt with and how they'll be dealt with.
Yeah, verse 25, thus says the Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and am hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles, then they will dwell in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob, and they will dwell safely there, build houses, plant vineyards. Yes, they will dwell securely when I execute judgments on all those around them who despise them. Then they shall know that I am the Lord their God.
Right, so they'll dwell safely and dwell securely. Same words are used in Ezekiel 38 for safety and security, yeshav v'tak. And it's a security that they get, and not a relative term, it's a security that, according to Ezekiel, when he uses these terms, it's a security they've obtained militarily, so they no longer have to be concerned about their enemies around them who despise them. And they won't dwell safely until it says judgments are executed upon those around them who despise them. And it says in those two verses that Israel is going to be a safe dwelling, vineyard planting, home building nation. But they can't do that right now because of the prickling briar and painful thorn around them. So they have to be dealt with, and they're going to be dealt with in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 2, in my estimation. I think that's all part of Psalm 83 as well. But Zechariah 12:2 tells us the time is going to come when Jerusalem will become a cup of trembling unto all those people around them who despise them, the prickling briar and the painful thorn. And they're going to make a final attempt to lay siege against both Judah and Jerusalem. So they're going to make a final attempt in Zechariah 12:2 to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem. That's going to be unsuccessful. And the Lord's going to lift up the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, in Zechariah 12:6 to execute judgments upon them. And here's what it says in Zechariah 12, verse 6. In that day, the Jerusalem becomes a cup of trembling, and then making siege against Judah and Jerusalem. I will make the governors or the captains read that as the IDF of Judah like a fire pan in the woodpile, and like a fiery torch in the sheaves. They shall devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left, but Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place. So in other words, that's when the prickling briar and painful thorn will be removed. The preconditions, the walls can come down, unwalled villages Israel can dwell securely in the land of unwalled villages without bars or gates. But they can't do that right now because there's enemies around them who despise them that Israel has to deal with. And we see that's been going on since Israel became a nation, with all the wars they've been fighting.
So let me ask you about that. Last night, I mentioned that you were going to be on the program today, and I said I want to ask Bill about Zechariah chapter 12. I'm looking at it, the timing of it. Some of Zechariah chapter 12 is definitely at the second coming of Christ when Israel cries out for Jesus to come back. Verse 10. Prior to that, you have some different dynamics that are going on when Jerusalem becomes a trembling cup, a burdensome stone, and then you go into the rest of that section right there with everything that you just quoted. Can you put together the timing? Is all of that is any of that coming up during the tribulation, or is all of this coming up beforehand? The part that you just mentioned, they're going to be like David was. And I'm curious as to putting together the timing of those first verses 1 through 9.
Yeah, I've written an article on prophecydepot.com called Zechariah 12 part of Armageddon, because a lot of our colleagues, Tom, believe that Zechariah 12 is part of Armageddon. They compare to Zechariah 14 and Revelation 19, etc. But in my estimation, Zechariah 12, 1 through 9 is not in the tribulation, and Zechariah 10 thereon is in the millennium. There's a gap in between verse 9 and verse 10. So the difference is really, I point out, is that in Zechariah 12:2, there's an unsuccessful siege by the surrounding Arab peoples, not by the nations at large. In Zechariah 14, there's a successful siege by the Lord gathers all the armies of the earth to Jerusalem. They capture half the city. They capture the city. They rifle the houses. They ravish the women. That's all a very successful siege. This is not what we're talking about here. It goes on and talks about in verse 3 that, skip verse 3, but let's go to verse 4. In that day when Jerusalem becomes a cup of trembling to the surrounding peoples, it's clearly the surrounding peoples, the painful thorn pricking briar, that I will strike every horse with confusion and its rider with madness, and I will open my eyes on the house of Judah, and will strike every horse of peoples with blindness. So the Lord actually intervenes to help the Jewish people to be successful in the siege that's coming against them by the Arab people. He's going to probably mess up with their guidance systems and malfunctions, equipment malfunctions. So could be panic and hysteria. That seems to be what verse 3 is saying. And it says in verse 5, when the governors of Judah see this, they shall say in their hearts, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are my strength, and the Lord of hosts their God. So in other words, when the Jewish people see the Lord intervene divinely at the time of the siege in that day, they're going to gain confidence. And then it says, in that day I will make the IDF, the governors of Judah, like a fire pan on the wood pile. This is verse 6. Like a fiery torch in the sheaves, and they shall devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left, that pricking briar and painful thorn. But Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place. So if you're going to put Zechariah 12:6, the IDF defeating the surrounding people in Armageddon, that means they're defeating China, the USA, all the armies that are gathered against Jerusalem. And that's just not scripturally sound. And they also have to say the Lord's going to intervene and cause confusion and madness and hysteria in Zechariah 12, verse 4. The reason they get concerned, they say Zechariah 12, verse 3, says it talks about Jerusalem being a heavy stone, all the peoples who would heave it away would surely be cut in pieces. It's a warning to the nations, don't meddle with the status of Jerusalem. And there's no heavy stone in Zechariah 14. They just move into Jerusalem and mow it right over and take over the city. But people who try to meddle, like France right now in the UK, they're talking about making a two-state solution. They're in jeopardy of having a burdensome stone fall upon them, according to Zechariah 12, verse 3. So we'll see if that even comes together.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple of things. And when I look at, you go verses 4 through 9, it is the people of Israel that rise up in the tribulation. At the end, it's Jesus who rescues them. Israel is being, the Jews are being, they're just being ravished, as you mentioned, quoting from Zechariah chapter 14, second half of tribulation is not going to be good. So clearly, for me, it's pretty easy to make the case, verses 4 through 9, that, look, this is Israel. And in fact, when I look at Israel right now, it is amazing to see they just keep having victory after victory, and there's so much more pressure that is coming from the West now, especially when you look at Europe and Australia, nations that would at least somewhat give their backing to Israel. We're watching this. Okay, now with this, it reads a couple of different, there's a couple of different things in here, and maybe you help me understand it. So you have when the surrounding peoples, I totally get that, see that exactly, but it also says in verse 3, it says, it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces. And then right after that, it says, though all of the earth are gathered against it. So clearly it's the surrounding nations that are coming against it, but though all the earth is gathered against it. How do you, when you see those, there's two different things going on there. What's your thinking on that?
Okay, so it says in that day, so it's in the day that the surrounding peoples are going to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem, and it'll be unsuccessful. Not in that day where it's a successful siege in Zechariah 14, when all the nations are gathered of the earth to Jerusalem, capture the city, rifle the houses, and ravish the women. It's a different time. It also talks about at that time, in that day, when the siege of the Arabs are coming against Jerusalem, that Jerusalem will be a heavy stone. There's no heavy stone impediment in Zechariah chapter 14. So he's also talking about gathered, it can also mean assembled against it. So in my estimation, what he's saying there is that when you see the Arab-Israeli conflict coming to a pinnacle, when you see that ultimately it'll end with a siege upon Judah and Jerusalem, and in that interim period of time, that window period of time, you're going to have the nations of the earth are going to meddle and assemble against Israel. And the Lord is warning them, don't do that. Like the United Nations, for instance, or whatever. Don't do that because it'll be like a heavy stone that can sorely fall on you and sorely wound you. But again, to me, it's contrast to Zechariah 14. There's no heavy stone or burden in that day. And we're not talking about in that day. We're talking about in that day in Zechariah 12, too, when Jerusalem becomes a cup of trembling.
Okay, so it says, though all the nations of the earth are gathered against it, what does that mean in that? At the end of verse 3, all the nations.
I don't jump that out to Zechariah 14 because I think it's all in context of in that day of Zechariah 12, when Jerusalem siege with a cup of trembling.
No, I do too, but I'm curious as to, you go from the surrounding nations and then all of a sudden you have all the nations gathered against her. Is that what we are watching building up to? So let me ask you this, are you saying then it's the immediate surrounding nations like we're watching now, the peoples right around, they're surrounding Israel? They are coming against Israel. That's obvious, especially when you start looking at the terror groups. Okay, but with that, then it says all the nations are gathered against her. Is this alluding to something like while these Arab communities, the immediate nations are coming against her, it's also at a time when the entire world starts to, like through the UN or what we're watching right now with the UK, Canada, France, Australia, that are definitely coming against Israel. Is that what that is referring to? They're coming against them, but not physically. The physical attacks are coming from the surrounding Arab communities. Is that?
Yeah, I consider it a warning not to meddle, and they're all assembling, or you can say gathering together. They're all assembling to meddle for a two-state solution. This has got the whole history of meddling going on since 1948, when Israel and the partition plan was designated, Jerusalem was designated as a international zone. And then after the Arabs got defeated in 1949, the green line was drawn there, and it was a line of demarcation. And they tried to divide Jerusalem at that point in time to the east and the west, which is not biblically supported. That didn't last because in 1967, Israel conquered in the Six-Day War and took it all over. But they made the mistake, of course, of giving the Temple Mount control of Jordan and things like that. But they've been trying to meddle with the status of Jerusalem and Israel ever since 1948, but it's increasing. And I think the warning is don't meddle, especially as we get to the point we're at right now, where ultimately the Arabs are going to lay siege, the pricking briar and painful thorn. They're going to make a physical siege and attack on Judah and Jerusalem, which is, they call the West Bank now Judah, but Samaria and Judah is the biblical names.
It's really fascinating when you look at that. As I watch what's happening right now, and then we're going to get to Iran, everybody, in a few more minutes. But as I watch it, we can't we can't say, okay, this is going to happen by such and such date. But if I look at Zechariah chapter 12, and the way I read verses 1 through 9, and what I'm watching take place with Israel, because Israel keeps having these victories that it's like somebody comes against them and Israel is victorious. It's just like happening time and time again. Even when Iran launched their missiles, the two times they launched the ballistic missiles, Israel still comes out ahead. They're coming out ahead every time. And it's like this direction has already been set for what's going to happen in Ezekiel, in Zechariah chapter 12, with the victory that Israel's going to have, because God's going to be the one who empowers the people of Israel, the IDF. And as I look at the rhetoric that's coming from the entire world right now. The U.S. doesn't seem to be as much, but the rest of the world does. I'm looking, we could be on the verge of Zechariah chapter 12. And, you know, I'm not going to put a date on it, but I'm curious, do you see it as something that's that close? Like I do?
Well, I think that you're going to see this really heat up real quickly, especially now that you see that Israel is trying to annex the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. They're moving to annex that territory and make it part of Israel proper. That's going to really upset the pricking fire and painful thorn of Arabs around them, who are, you know, panicking because Israel is totally away from a two-state solution, any potential of that. That ship has gone and sailed. And you and I put this in our prophetic documentaries, the pre-tribulation prophecies, that the Israeli Defense Forces exist in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Ezekiel 37:10 says it will be an exceedingly great army. And they show up in defeating Damascus in Isaiah 17, verse 9, Jordan in Jeremiah 49, verse 2, Zephaniah 2, verses 8 and 9, Egypt in Isaiah 19, 16 through 18, Saudi Arabia. We get into all the prophecies where they're defeating Lebanon, Gaza, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Syria. We covered that in the prophetic documentary that we did, Tom.
Yeah. I mean, we truly live in amazing days as we are watching things move forward. I don't know if you caught this. I'm sure you did. You pay attention to everything. But Canada, I guess, in Canada, some of the people there are pushing for IDF soldiers who have dual citizenship in Canada and in Israel to face war crimes. These are 20-year-olds that were fighting for the IDF, come home to Canada to see their family with the possibility of being charged with war crimes. It's just insane, but we are watching this anti-Semitism form in so many different ways. And again, these nations that are forming against Israel, even in the rhetoric that they are doing. It's really
the line, October 7th, Tom, the line got drawn in the sand when Hamas made that attack. October 8th, Hezbollah came in behind them in support. And at this point, Israel is doing what they know they needed to do, which is, you know, to take out those proxies. But the problem that Israel's facing is that everybody's saying that they're too excessive on their defeat of the Hamas and the Gaza, and there's all these deaths. But, you know, the bottom line is Israel's doing what it's got to do to, you know, clean house and be safe. And they got a prickling briar and painful thorn around them with walls all about them. They can't dwell securely. And God has designed Ezekiel 38 as a marquee prophecy of the end times, because through this prophecy, we're told in Ezekiel 39:7, after he stops it supernaturally in Ezekiel 38 verses 18 through Ezekiel 39:5, he's going to start with a great earthquake. Every man's sword is going to be against his brother. There'll be pestilence and bloodshed, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. It's going to be clear that God had to intervene in Ezekiel 38 and stop it because it was too formidable of a force for Israel's IDF to take them out. And here's what it says here. So, and when that happens and the world sees all that go on, God will put the world on official notice that he's the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promise-keeping God of those who put their faith in Jesus Christ. And it says, so I will make my holy name known. This is Ezekiel 39, verse 7. I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. And I will not let them profane my holy name anymore. And the nation shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel, which requires two things. The existence of my people Israel, the painful thorn can't destroy them. And the land of Israel still needs to be in their possession because he's the Holy One in Israel. That's where this is all headed, Tom. This is a marquee event. God's going to put the world on notice that he's God. And these Arabs are going to be in trouble if they keep messing with this. The international community is going to be in trouble with a heavy stone if they try to continue to meddle. That's the warning of Zechariah 12.
Well, that's great. Bill, let me ask you this. What is Gog's, G-O-G, everybody, Gog's two-part evil plan?
Well, you read it in Ezekiel 30. Do this. Read Ezekiel 38, 10 through 13.
Let me get
and then I'm going to ask them in a moment to put up that one slide that I sent you called Blockade the Waterways.
Sure.
It's got a map of the Middle East, but don't put the slide up until Tom reads Ezekiel 38, 10 through 13.
Verse 10 says, thus says the Lord of God, on that day it shall come to pass that thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. You will say, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, to take plunder, to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are yet inhabited, against a people gathered from the nations who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land. Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take great plunder?
So, okay, in just a moment, we're going to show an image on your end.
Okay.
But what you're talking about there, you got these protesters in verse 13 that clearly see that Gog of Magog and his coalition.
Okay, which image do you...
Primarily, the consensus is Russia, Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Algeria, perhaps Morocco and Tunisia. Some even throw Germany in there. So massive coalition.
Which image do you need up, Bill?
Okay. Well, in a moment, we're going to put up the one that's got the map with the arrows on it. Blockade the waterways.
Blockade the waterways. Can you guys pull that up? There it is. That one?
I don't see it on my end. Do you?
Yeah, it says Russia hooks in the jaws, blockade Israel's waterways. Yes.
Okay. Oh, that image there. The scene that you read in verse 13 is that there's a commerce going on. The merchants of Tarshish and their young lions are protesting on the sideline. Russia, what are you doing? You're coming for plunder and booty. In other words, you're coming to, we have commercial interests involved with Israel at this point in time. Sheba would be Yemen, which of course they got problems with now, so that has to change. The Houthis are there. Dedan would be Saudi Arabia, which they're going to have at some point have to normalize relationships with, but that's not ready to happen. But the merchants of Tarshish, probably the UK, and the young lions, probably could include America. They're barking on the sidelines, basically saying, what are you doing, Russia? You're coming to take away spoil, plunder, and booty. And you see, I think with Gog's evil plan, the first phase of it, we know the plan is he's going to come to take away Israel's prosperity. But the first phase of it, if you look at the map, the coalition members all are blockade strategic waterways that what Israel would use to export their commerce to the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions out to the Europe and out to the west, per se, and even to the east. So you see, Turkey could block the northern part of the Mediterranean. Libya could block the southern part of the Mediterranean. Algeria could block the, just before you get to the strait I forget the name of that strait there, but before they can get out of the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. Sudan and Ethiopia could block the Red Sea. Iran could block the Persian Gulf. So I'm speculating here, Tom, but I think the coalition is being put together with these Muslim countries who will hate Israel at this time, especially after they they defeat the Arabs and take away the prickling briar. I think Russia puts together this coalition of these Muslim countries that will blockade Israel's ability to get their commercial interests out to market. And then they're going to move in after they choke that off and try to take over that plunder and booty with their massive coalition and come down from the uttermost parts of the north. And that's when God has to stop them supernaturally.
That's a great map. I mean, that map really helps you to understand the different dynamics. That's a great map. Let me ask you this, Bill. Get this this question a lot. In fact, it came up. I was at a conference in Phoenix over the weekend. This came up during our Q&A time. Some of your friends were there, including Dr. Dave Reagan. It was a great time. But regarding Ezekiel 38, you make an argument that I make, and we may have covered it also in that prophetic documentary. What are some of the arguments for pre-tribulation timing? And understand, everybody, this isn't pre-rapture. That's not what we're talking about, but pre-tribulation timing.
I think there's probably four pretty good arguments.
Hey, Bill, let me put it into context for everybody first, for people who might be confused. So the rapture, everybody, does not begin the tribulation period. The confirmation of the covenant of Daniel chapter 9 with Antichrist, that begins the tribulation period. So the rapture has to happen sometime before the tribulation begins. Bill and I both believe there's a gap after the rapture. Rapture takes place, there's a gap. Sometime after that, Daniel chapter 9 covenant takes place. So Hence, back to the question again, so everybody's mind is tracking with us both. What are some of the arguments, Bill, for the pre-tribulation timing of the Ezekiel 38 war?
I think there's four pretty sound ones. The first one is not as sound, but I think it's important to note. We talked about it. Ezekiel 38 is a marquee event. It's the event God's going to make his holy name known in the midst of his people Israel and put the world on official notice he's God. And I think the timing to do that would be before the tribulation, because in the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to come on the scene and say, no, I'm God. I'm above all that's called God. Worship me. So I don't think God wants to do it too late in the program and slap his head forward and go, oy vey, I wish I would have done this pre-tribulation. I think he's going to do a pre-tribulation for that reason. It's a marquee event. He wants the world to know who he is before they have to make the bitter choice. It's going to come at them with supernatural deception, signs, and lying wonders after the rapture, according to 2 Thessalonians 2. But then again, one of the major arguments, I'll say the major argument at the end. Let's talk about the other two and three arguments. In the first half of the tribulation period, Israel is really not fighting any wars or at the threat of a war, because they've confirmed that covenant you talked about in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and Isaiah 28, verse 15. So they're at peace, they're dwelling at peace, they're going to the temple that exists at that time and reinstating the Mosaic law. So there really doesn't appear to be a war at that point in time. In the second half, they're fleeing for their lives because the Antichrist is coming at them with his armies. They're going to lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem, Zechariah 14. And so they're fleeing for their lives, and they don't appear to be engaged in a war with Russia at that point. Those are the kind of weaker arguments. But the strong arguments that Dr. Reagan puts forward, Dr. Rhodes, myself, and others, is we're given a clue in Ezekiel 39. It talks about in the aftermath of the supernatural defeat of the Gog and Magog invaders, that they're going to be burning the weapons that were brought forward by the invaders, to convert them to fuel for 7 years. That 7 years is a critical time clue, I think, because in the tribulation we just talked about it, the first 3.5 years, Israel's going to be dwelling at peace. They could be converting weapons into fuel. In the second half, they're fleeing for their lives to avoid the genocidal attempt of the Antichrist in the second half of the tribulation. If anything, they would grab a weapon to defend themselves on their way in flight. So the first 3.5 years before the tribulation, 3.5 years, first half of the tribulation. So you had 7 years, 3.5 years before the tribulation, 3.5 years in the tribulation. You could be converting weapons to fuel, but in the second half, that would be cut short. They could have 8 or 9 years worth of weapons, but at the mid part of the tribulation, they would cease because they had to flee for their lives to avoid the genocidal campaign of the Antichrist. So we're told in Zechariah 13:8 that 2/3 of the Jews in the land will be killed. So it's not a time to be converting weapons to fuel.
It was great. Excellent. I get this question a lot, and for me, it's pretty easy to answer, but people are just so hung up on it, and they're convinced Ezekiel 38 war is the same one that's spoken of in Revelation chapter 20 at the end of the millennial kingdom, because you have Gog that is mentioned in both. So because the name Gog is mentioned in both, people say, aha, therefore it's the same thing, and it's all at the end of the millennial kingdom. Bill, what do you say with that? And I believe you have an article about this too.
Yes, I cover this in the Millennium Prophecies book and DVD. There's several reasons that clearly differentiate between these two events. First of all, the battlefields are different. Ezekiel 39 verse 2 and Ezekiel 38:16 tells us that it takes place on the mountains of Israel, but in the Revelation 20 account, verse 9, says that the troops surround the camp of the saints in the beloved city of Jerusalem. So they're simply just coming to surround Jerusalem. The feats are different too. Ezekiel 38 verses 19 through 22 predicts a great earthquake. Every man's sword will be against his brother. Pestilence and bloodshed, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. But in Revelation 20, verse 9, only fire comes down from God out of heaven, not all the other supernatural mechanisms. The troops are different too. In Ezekiel 38 verses 2 through 7, it identifies a limited group of localized Muslim nations we just discussed who they were, led by Russia that invade from the north, but Revelation 20, verse 8, it speaks of an international army whose number is of the sand of the sea from nations which are around the four quarters of the earth. It involves an international army, not just the localized Muslim countries that we talked about. The leaders of the invasions are different as well. Ezekiel 38, 2 through 11 says it's the Gog and Magog. Gog is the leader of that, but in Revelation 20, verses 7 through 8, it's clearly Satan, released from the abyss. A few more I'll go through real quick. The timing of the weapons burning, Ezekiel 39, verse 9, we talked about this, emphasizes the weapons. The supply can provide fuel to burn for 7 years, but shortly after the second Magog prophecy concludes, you have a white throne judgment that happens, and then the eternal order starts. It seems unlikely to me, Tom, that the weapons will be burning during these two aftermath scenarios. And lastly, the timing of the regathering of Israel. Ezekiel 38:8 points out that the Jews are regathered from the nations to Israel. We read that at the start of the program. There's no hint of an additional Jewish dispersion that would require another regathering in the millennium. So thus, Revelation 27 through 10 happens over 1,000 years after Israel has been regathered. So I think it's clear that they're not the same event.
Yeah, I totally agree. That was really well said, and great detail, great answers. So again, you have the article, but you also have it in one of your books and DVDs, I think you said?
Yeah, the Millennium Prophecies in the New Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's just great. So there you go, everybody. Check that out. All right, will people want to know this one a lot, and the next one they want to know a lot. A lot of people ask me this. Will believers, people who are believers in Christ right now, will they witness Ezekiel 38 war?
Well, I'm glad you made the distinction between the rapture and the tribulation. It's not the rapture that starts the tribulation. We're not really clearly told that Ezekiel 38 happens before the rapture or after the rapture. It could happen. The rapture could happen before, during, or after. But I have several clues that I believe suggest the church won't witness Ezekiel 38. One of the clues is 3 times in Ezekiel 30 and 39, God refers to Israel as a client nation, my people Israel. This is all about Israel and God upholding his holy name through his people Israel. The other thing that comes up is 3 times we're told that the Jews will be cleansing the land in the aftermath of the supernatural defeat by God of the Magog invaders. And Ron Rhodes writes this in his book on page 159, Northern Storm Rising, a great book on Ezekiel 38, Northern Storm Rising. He says, from the perspective of the Jews, the dead must be buried because the exposed corpses are a source of ritual contamination to the land. Numbers 19:11 through 22, Deuteronomy 21:1 through 9. The land must therefore be completely cleansed and purged of all defilement. Neither the enemies nor their belongings, i.e. their weapons, can be left to pollute the land. So it appears to me that the church is gone. The Jews are reinstating the Mosaic law, cleansing the land as part of the ritual requirement of the Mosaic law.
Well, so fascinating as we put all of these things together. I only have a couple more questions for you, but they're so intriguing when you start looking at this and try to put everything together, and people want to know. So here it is. You've written a lot on Iran. We can see everything going on right now. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but there's so many things we could talk about because of current things. But why is Jeremiah 49, verse 34 through 39, the prophecy of Elam, not the same as Ezekiel 38, the prophecy of Persia, since both ancient Elam and Persia comprise modern-day Iran?
Okay, that's a good question. I have a slide that I sent to your crew. It's got an image that says, are Jeremiah 49 and Ezekiel 38 the same prophetic event? If they could pop that up.
There you go. Okay, it's up.
Okay, I see it. Okay, there's different battlefields. The war of Ezekiel 38 takes place inside of Israel. The invaders come up from the far parts of the north upon the mountains of Israel. The disaster that happens in Jeremiah chapter 49 in Elam, which hugs the Persian Gulf, was on the southwest side of Iran. That happens in Iran, not in Israel. Also, God defeats Ezekiel 38. We talked about that supernaturally: earthquake, fire and brimstone, flooding rains, hailstones. But this is a disaster that's brought about inside of Iran. It appears that Iran's got enemies. Those who want to consume them by the sword, type of war. So we have different defeats. The enemies defeat Elam, whereas God defeats the invaders of Ezekiel 38. And it's interesting because in Ezekiel 32, verses 24 through 25, we find out that Ezekiel is very familiar with Elam, but he doesn't mention Elam in the Jeremiah and his Ezekiel 38 prophecy. He's very specific about who he mentions. Togarmah, Gomer, Meshach, Tubal, etc., Put, Cush. And he seems to intentionally omit Elam, who he knows about, according to Ezekiel 32, verses 24 through 25. I think he intentionally omits Elam because it's not part of that prophecy.
It's all so intriguing to me, especially as we look at what's going on today. I want to ask you about Psalm 83 in just a second, and why, and not part of Ezekiel chapter 38, which you can see Jeremiah the same way that you just talked about. But I want to ask you about that in a second. But first of all, Bill, somebody wants to keep in touch with you. How can they do that?
You can go to Prophecy Depot, like homedepot.com. That's our website. We got our articles, videos there. We have a YouTube site also. If you just type Bill Salus, Salus, search that on YouTube. And they can go to my website and they can get it. My contact information is all right there at prophecydepot.com.
Great, thank you. Bill, okay, and again, we'll get Psalm 83 in a second, but as we look at what's going on today, let me ask you this, do you think, Israel and the U.S., I think, is possible, could strike Iran at any minute, because things are not, Trump hasn't done the best job of getting things to scale down. In fact, the things like the rhetoric worldwide for war seems to be higher than it's been.
Well, if there's any implications of the prophecy of Elam in Jeremiah chapter 49, we just talked about, which is on the west coast of Iran, where Iran has its missile silos, portable rocket launchers, underground airport, ballistic missiles. It's also where the Natanz enrichment facility is, the Isfahan research facility, the Bushehr nuclear reactor, the Shiraz, where they design their ballistic missiles. It's all right there in that strategic area. If that's part of the attack that might happen, it says that Iran has, at that time, they have enemies, plural. So it'd be more than, and we're not told it's Israel specific. So it could involve more than just Israel. It could involve the United States, even more coalition. But I think what Donald Trump's up against right now is Iran is being belligerent. Khomeini's coming out saying, no one can tell us what to do about our nuclear enrichment program. Recently, Trump actually connected with Putin and suggested maybe Putin could help broker and negotiate a deal with Iran as well, which is absolutely absurd. I think the more he tries to get this deal together, Mr. Art of the deal, I think he's going to get frustrated by Iran. And at some point, he may just say, okay, the other alternative, which he keeps talking about, we'll have to go the other way, the other route. Well, he would maybe join with Israel to do that. And Israel really needs us to do that because we got those big bunker buster bombs that can go deep sunk into Iran's underground facilities. So I would not be surprised for Trump to get frustrated and go lockstep with Israel and take care of this. Because right now he's convinced Benjamin Netanyahu he's compromised him by saying, don't attack until we've exhausted all possibilities of a deal. And apparently Netanyahu's agreed to that, which is a foolish mistake. So I think it may involve the United States and Israel, and it probably will happen pretty soon.
Yeah, and then it was also Trump who said, hey, everything's good now with the Houthis in Yemen. We're going to back off. And what was it, hours later, they launch a missile at Israel. You look at this negotiating that's going on. I mean, these people are evil. Jelani's evil. He's a terrorist. I don't know. All right. So I'll digress and start saying all kinds of things here in a minute. But let me ask you, Psalm 83, Bill, you're really the person that brought that to light. And your thoughts about Psalm 83, specifically not part of Ezekiel 38. We've already established before that You believe it's a real war, and actually, the further we go along in life, the more I look at the Bible, the more, Bill, I believe you're right. You know, I look at it. I know there's a lot of other people that are colleagues of ours that think differently, but I'll go on the record as saying I believe you're right about Psalm 83. And also, as I look at Zechariah chapter 12, I believe you're right about that too. I look at these things and go, man, and even your prophecy of Elam, you know, same thing, Jeremiah chapter 49. I'll tell you this much, we live in days where all of these things are on the table right now. But Psalm 83 versus Ezekiel 38, what the differences there?
Yes. Well, we've covered Ezekiel 38 pretty exhaustively so far. Psalm 83, for those viewers who are not familiar with it, talks about those neighboring nations that are actually, we probably covered them in Zechariah 12:2, to the right hand and left hand of Israel, share common borders. You got Lebanon, where the Hezbollah are. You got Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Palestinians. This is a confederacy comprised of these Arab peoples, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Gaza, where the Hamas are. It says they come together and form a confederacy in a crafty plan. And we're told in Psalm 83, verse 4, they want to come together and cut the nation of Israel off, that the name of Israel will be remembered no more. They form a confederacy, that group of countries. None of those countries are listed in Ezekiel 38. So that, I believe, will make a final siege on Judah and Jerusalem in Zechariah 12:2, those countries, trying to continue to take over the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, and all that, maintain control over that. I believe that the prickling briar and painful thorn of Ezekiel 28, verse 24. And the differences between Ezekiel 38 and Psalm 83 is that those are Arabs versus Jews. They provide an inner circle of countries that share common borders with Israel. Ezekiel 38 is predominantly non-Arabs versus the Jews, an outer ring of countries that don't share common borders with Israel, never been Israel's notorious enemies throughout time, but the Arabs have been, the prickling briar. The goal of Psalm 83 is they want to take the land. It says in verse 12, let's take the promised land, the pastures of God for our possession. But that's not the same goal of Ezekiel 38. They want to take the plunder and the booty. There's different defeats. The Lord supernaturally stops Ezekiel 38. But the Israeli Defense Forces militarily, which we point out in the prophetic documentary we did, Tom, clearly devastate their foes around them. And the end results are God makes his holy name known in the midst of his people Israel in Ezekiel 38. And Psalm 83 is an end of the ancient hatred that has plagued Israel from time immemorial by the Jews, the Arabs around them.
That was great. Well, and that slide that you put together is so helpful, just being able to look at that and being able to get the visual to help people understand. Bill, it's been a great program today. Hey, listen, everyone, we have Bill's DVDs, books in the Hope for Our Time store. You can check it out. Bill also even has on his own website, you can register for his newsletter. I highly recommend you do it. Bill, I mean, you can read things Bill has in writing. It'll help you to study through things. You have arguments, it'll help you to form an argument, but I think Bill does a pretty good job of eliminating many of the arguments that are out there. But again, subscribe to his newsletter like mine. It's free to just get the newsletter. And I encourage you to go for that. Connect with Bill, Prophecy Depot Ministries. You will be blessed. Bill, it's always great to have you on. You're such a wealth of knowledge. Really appreciate you as a friend and as a brother and a colleague. And may the Lord bless you. Listen, everybody, I'll be talking about updating some news tonight in just a little while. Check it out on our Today in Prophecy program coming up in just a couple of hours. God bless you, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and I will see you next time.